Vision Vision Conversation with the incomparable Nikole Hannah-Jones from the New York Times and creator of the 1619 Project. We will do an introduction, a proper introduction of Ms. Hannah-Jones, who has asked me to call her Nikole, so I will oblige and call her Nikole. We are absolutely honored to have you here this evening with us. My name is Dr. Terry Ann Scott. I am the director of the Institute for Common Power and a former professor of African American history and chair of the department. I left a tenured position to join the Institute. So we will tell you a little bit about the work we do and why we have asked Nikole to join us this evening, because she has been a champion for the kinds of ideologies and work that we are trying to accomplish here. I am joined by my colleague, Charles Douglas, who is the executive director of Common Power and formerly for over a decade worked in marketing at Starbucks, who is joining us actually this evening from Auburn, Alabama, just fresh coming from Las Vegas, Nevada, where he and a group of about 50 volunteers were knocking on doors and mobilizing voters. Common Power is an organization that is Seattle-based. It was started in 2018, and we mobilize volunteers for voters around the country, and we also invest in the next generation of leadership. You can imagine that in this election year, 2024, our work is eminently important. It always has been. But right now, we have so much at stake, and we will be doing all that we can to make sure that we have an election that allows for all people to be included in the folds of American democracy. We started the Institute for Common Power just 2 years ago. We're actually celebrating our 2-year anniversary this June. And the idea is that for people to be sustained in the work that we are doing, to be able to have longevity in this work, to understand the gravity of the importance of voting, to understand the history of race and racism and voter suppression in this country, then we had to offer them opportunities to learn about it. And that's through lectures and courses and taking people on learning tours through the South, through national educational events, and through important vision conversations like the one that we're going to have this evening with Nikole Hannah-Jones. It's my great honor to be able to introduce Ms. Nikole Hannah-Jones. She is a domestic correspondent for the New York Times Magazine, and in 2020, she won the Pulitzer Prize for the New York Times best-selling book, The 1619 Project, A New Origin Story. It's now available in paperback, and she is joining us while she is going to be engaged in a long journey of a book tour for that paper book. It's also a documentary. It's a children's book. It's a podcast. It has created tremendous change and conversation. She's a MacArthur Fellow, also known as the Genius Awards. She's a co-founder of the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting at Morehouse College. She's a Knight Chair in Race and Journalism at Howard University. They're extremely lucky to have her. And she founded the Howard University Center for Journalism and Democracy. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Thank you so much for joining us. We are honored, absolutely honored to have you with us this evening.
Thank you. Happy to be in conversation with everyone. It was fun seeing all the roll calls coming in and where everyone was joining us from.
One of the things that's really important with Common Power and the basis for a lot of how we build is relationships. And I just want to shout out, Nikole, that we met you in person in Selma because you're on the board for Foot Soldiers Park. And Foot Soldiers Park started by one Miss Joanne Bland, the only Miss Joanne Bland. And if you go to Selma, you haven't been to Selma until Miss Joanne guides you through. And she's been somebody who we've had a great relationship with for a very long time. Dr. Terry and David Domke lead tours to the South. And on one of those trips, we met you there. And this would not have happened without that relationship happening first. And shout out to Miss Joanne, shout out to Foot Soldiers Park, and shout out to all the good people supporting the work there in Selma. Thank you for your time with them.
Absolutely. Thank you. So for our first question, because the way that the format will go this evening is we will talk to you. We'll have a conversation. We have some questions. We have one of our educators from the Institute who works with us who will come and ask questions. And for you who are out there in the audience, we ask that you drop questions in the chat. And 2 of the members of our organization will be able to collect those and give them to us. So at the Institute for Common Power, we connect the past to the present. We historicize what is happening today. And so for my first question, I want to start with a slide for you. Today is June 11th, 2024. 61 years ago, on this day, a number of monumental things happened in this country. If you look at those top two pictures, this was the day that Governor George Wallace in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, at the University of Alabama, quote, stood in the schoolhouse door and tried to prevent two African-American students from integrating the University of Alabama. Now, this was how many? 9 years after the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. And you can see those two students there in the corner, Vivian Malone and James Hood. And the Kennedy administration made him stand aside after he had barked many things about states' rights. And it was that evening, June 11th, that JFK got on television and talked about the racial disparities in wealth in this country and said that a Black child should be born with the same opportunities as a white child. And he called the civil rights movement a moral imperative. And it was that evening that when Medgar Evers was coming home from his office in Jackson, Mississippi, he was killed by an assassin's bullet, Byron De La Beckwith. And so all of these things happened then, June 11th, 1963, 61 years ago. And here we are, 61 years later, and we are dealing with some of the same issues that were at play at the time. So what can you say to us about that?
About the fact that we're dealing with so many of the same issues?
Yes, related to school segregation, states' rights, and so many other things.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of remarkable. So one, I think we should also point out that Medgar Evers was a World War II veteran.
Mm-hmm.
And as one of my colleagues from the Times tweeted out, he survived Normandy. He actually was one of the soldiers who landed at Normandy only to be killed by white supremacists in Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And I think in some ways, that fact, and the white supremacists who killed him, as you know, Byron De La Beckwith was also a World War II soldier. Mm-hmm. So the so-called greatest generation was coming home and violently suppressing the rights of other Black folks and even Black folks who had fought to liberate Europe. And I think in many ways that summarizes the American experience, that we have always been a deeply hypocritical nation, in tension with the image of a great democracy and a liberating force across the world, while grappling to ensure basic rights for citizens here in the United States. When I think about those two things, so of course, Medgar was organizing for voting rights. This is 1963 is before we see any of the great civil rights legislation that would pass. Of course, Kennedy would be assassinated after that. And Lyndon B. Johnson, who was actually my favorite president. Black folks love to have JFK on their wall, but the man who actually delivered on civil rights was LBJ. Mm-hmm. He's the one who helped propel the 64, 65, and eventually the 68 Civil Rights Acts through Congress. So I think we shouldn't be, I think sometimes when we see these images in black and white, we think this was a long time ago.
Right.
13 years before I was born. Right. That Black folks were still having to fight for basic rights of citizenship that everyone else enjoyed. So in some ways, we shouldn't be surprised that we're still having these battles, that a nation that just 60 years ago didn't think Black people should have the right to vote, didn't think Black people should have the right to use public accommodations, thought it was okay to segregate Black folks, and where we were having to have the National Guard just to allow us to go into universities that our parents paid tax dollars for, by the way, that this is a very recent history, and that in fact, it's been a very short time that we've even tried to attain multiracial democracy. So of course, it is under attack. We were never meant to have a democracy where Black and brown people get to determine leadership.
Let's stick with Medgar Evers in 1963. You talked about how he was fighting for voting rights, and one of the things that I'm going to be doing on this, Terry is the best historian in common power. No shade to Dr. David Domke. One of the things I'll be doing is bringing it to the present, though. And I've got to ask this because we were just in Nevada with 50 volunteers who are essentially doing some of the same things, pushing against those who would tear down our democracy, fighting for voting rights. What are some of the lessons that we can bring forward from maybe Medgar Evers himself from 1963 generally, to put into practice today. We take these trips down to the South. We study history so that we can do better today in today's fight. Is there anything specific that pops out for you from him or from that year?
Well, yeah, a few things. I mean, one, you have to begin with the sheer courage
Yeah.
of what this man was doing. This is Mississippi. Mississippi was the most strictly apartheid state in the United States. It was also the most violent against Black people in the United States. It lynched the most Black people of any state in America. There was no FBI office in Mississippi until two white civil rights workers were murdered, Goodman and Schwerner. So no help was coming. Right. If the Klan wanted to get you and you called law enforcement, the Klan was law enforcement.
Right.
So the incredible bravery of people who stayed and worked in their own backyard, right? There were a lot of brave folks who fought in the movement, many who would fly down south, do some organizing, and then they could go back home to the safety of wherever it was that they came from. But Medgar was doing his work where he lived amongst his people. And so I think that is any real organizing that's going to be successful has to have and deeply involve and embed people who live in those communities, that people who are trusted in those communities and people who are brave. We haven't had as much political violence, obviously, now as then, but we are seeing an uptick in political violence. We can look at what happened with the poll workers in Georgia, right? The two Black women. The threats of violence against poll workers in Detroit that we're seeing all over the country. So I think there's a lot of lessons there. But I think probably the biggest lesson that I would take from Medgar Evers, especially as we're going into a presidential election, where people don't seem to care too much for either candidate, right? And particularly Black Americans who don't necessarily feel that the current president has delivered on some of the promises that have been made. When Medgar Evers was organizing for voting rights, there was no candidate speaking to Black issues, period. Right? There wasn't. They were fighting for the right because if they didn't have the right to vote, candidates would never have to speak to Black issues because Black people could not help determine elections. So what we have always had to be as Black folks in America are pragmatic voters. We unfortunately have never been able to be aspirational voters. We have to vote to try to maintain our rights. We have to vote for the person often who, for us, is the lesser of two evils. Now, I don't think Trump and Biden, you cannot equate these two men whatsoever. But I think our lesson is a lot of people feel a lot of apathy around voting, especially younger people who feel like no matter who they vote for, not that much changes. People who feel like we're kind of veering towards oligarchy, that both political parties are just overrun with money and influence from billionaires and not enough influence from the regular folks who have to deal with these policies, that we have to take a lesson from those who literally sacrificed their lives for our right to vote, which is we have an obligation to vote even if our candidates are not ideal. That we have an obligation to protect our communities, even if we don't feel particularly excited about one political candidate over another. We know clearly that one would help disenfranchise us, try to overturn our vote. When Black women, particularly in places like Georgia and Philadelphia and Detroit, delivered that election, then he said that our votes shouldn't count. So we have a duty. And when you bring up someone like Medgar, literally a martyr, for us to have the rights that we have, we just have to understand that is our obligation, not just as Black folks, but as all Americans, that those who died for our right to vote did not die in vain.
Absolutely.
Okay, I just wanted to follow up, Terry, that just 20 minutes in, Nikole dropped probably the heaviest, the heaviest topic of the night.
Heaviest topic of the night and one that's closest to our hearts.
That's exactly right. The second thing I would add is that the part about working with local folks, I just want to call out, that is why anytime Common Power goes anywhere, we only work through people who are in that state. We're never going to stayed alone. I love that you said that.
Right. So local people are leading our efforts and telling us what they need to see. You hit on so many things, and a couple of them in particular that I want to highlight when you talked about the courage, because even when we draw those historical parallels and we see that kind of through line, and we see that we have so much work to do, we see a backlash against Black progress, we also have to recognize the accomplishments that we have made because of people like Medgar Evers. And I often talk about history as a self-help book, that if they could do that then there's no stopping us. So I'm so happy that you illuminated the kind of courage that it required for him to do that. And not only that, but the fact that there was no one for them to call. And the people who they called were actually the ones who were in the Klan and the White Citizens Council. Something else that I want to ask you about. Voting. We have an obligation to vote. You are unwavering about that. We are unwavering about that. I'm watching people come in on the chat saying, how do I tell young people to vote? What do I do? One of the things, the ways that we can often get them to vote and to think about that is to think about the importance of local elections and what local elections mean and how it's tied to so many things, like, for instance, education. Just yesterday, the South Carolina Board of Education removed African American Studies as an AP course. The irony of that is beyond glaring, and it actually gives me goosebumps to think about that from a state that was a Black majority, from a state that is so central to our history, and that it is one state of so many where this is happening. I know for you, you have
The
said
most Africans trafficked into the United States came through the Port of Charleston.
right.
It's
Amen.
insane.
Thank
It's
you.
insane. Yeah.
And you continue, you've talked about the importance of African American studies for you. Can you further explain to our audience why this is happening, what it means, and what we can do about it?
Yes. Before I get into that, though, I just want to affirm what you just said about local and state elections, because I think what we can't do with young people is dismiss how they feel. They have legitimate reasons to feel like they feel. And I always am amazed at how older folks want to talk down on young people and then expect them to listen to us at the same time. It doesn't work. I feel apathetic about this presidential election, honestly. I mean, I know what I have to do. And I'm going to do what I have to do, but we have to acknowledge why they feel like they feel, and then help explain to them that though the media might only pay attention to elections every 4 years and the presidential election, that what has the most impact on their lives are their local, right? Their municipal elections, their state elections. Just look at the abortion bans, right? Just look at, like you said, state legislature banning, literally, first they said, when they came after CRT, that they weren't banning Black history.
Right.
Then they were like, just kidding, we're actually banning Black history, right? So I think, like, just helping young people understand, you know what, you have a right to feel exactly how you feel about the presidential election, but there's more at stake here. I think it's a really important strategy, because people, and no matter, even if we had the most amazing presidential candidates, as you all know, most of what impacts your life every day is not what happens in DC. It's what happens in your state house, and it's what happens on your city council and your county board. So I think that helping young people understand that, but not dismissing them and not diminishing their concerns is really important, and trying to find a way instead to encourage them to go out and vote for their community, if nothing else. So why are they banning Black history? It's actually pretty easy. I get a question a lot about why is it Black history in particular that gets targeted, right? No one's coming after Asian American history, European history, excuse me, Indigenous history, though they could for similar reasons. The reason they ban Black history is inherently political, because Black history gives life to the entire American project. So if you want to teach these ideas of American exceptionalism, that we were founded on freedom and ideas of liberty, we're the greatest democracy the world has ever seen, how do you deal with us? How do you deal with why Black people are in this country at all? Well, then you have to acknowledge the lie, the crack at our foundation. How do you talk about, when we open talking about Medgar Evers, how do you tell that mythological narrative about the greatest generation and then acknowledge that Black folks had to wage a double V for victory campaign, victory abroad and victory at home?
Right.
that Black men were getting lynched for wearing their uniforms,
Mhm.
that Black men could see German prisoners of war being served in cafes in the South that they could not go in as American citizens. So when you teach Black history, then you teach a story of America that does not merely glorify and mythologize this country. There's no way to teach Black history without tearing down the myths.
Yeah.
And that's why Black history becomes so targeted. So commonly, the 1619 Project, people often refer to it as a work of history. But as you know, as a historian, what history really is memory.
Mhm.
Everything that happened, but we
Mhm.
just don't learn about most of it. And so what we're really learning is this particular historical moments framed a particular way to make us have the same shared memory of our country. And Black history, African American studies, the 1619 Project is saying, actually, we want to give a different shared memory of this country, one that is more honest. And that's dangerous to power, right? Because power uses memory to justify its power. If you believe that we're an exceptionally free nation, that anyone who wants to work hard doesn't have to struggle, then if you believe that, you don't challenge the grave inequality that we see all across our society. You don't challenge why, one man can hold billions and billions of dollars on the back of low-wage Amazon workers. And, he has so much money, he can just go to the moon for fun and thank the low-wage worker that's having to urinate in a bottle in the car because they don't get bathroom breaks, right? If you don't learn the history that built that, then you don't challenge the structural inequality that you see. And power likes to operate invisibly. Power likes to operate as if it has a mandate to operate that way. And these more truer versions of history challenge us to think about and imagine a different society and to know that the society we have has been constructed and it doesn't have to maintain or be maintained the way that it is.
I've got a question, and maybe Terry, this might be for you too. So, Terry, you are a tenured professor in African American history you were in the educational system for your whole life before leaving to join Common Power. And Nikole, you've got this massive education project that exists outside of traditional educational norms and government. Is the future of more honest and involved citizens, more civically responsible citizens who would learn this history? Is it that we enshrine better this kind of education within government, that we try to make that change within the system, or do you think that at least in the near future, that these solutions will come from outside the government first as a model?
So I feel like you were asking that of myself and Terry.
Both of y'all. Yeah, I want
Yeah.
to see what Terry has to say
I would
too.
love to hear what you think, Terry, and then I'll respond.
Yeah, repeat the last part of that, Charles, because I want to make sure I understand.
I mean, the simple version of that is, do you think that we reform education by reforming the government first, that the solution is within the government, or do you think that we should push for something outside the government that's an example of that, like we have with Common Power and like Nikole has with the 1619 Project?
You have to step outside of the traditional confines of education. The reason I left the academy is so that what I could teach and what I could learn could extend beyond the classroom. And so it comes from the bottom up and from the top down. We take people on tours through the South to teach them this history, to empower people on an individual level so that they go back into their spaces and they can spread that information and use that power to expose why structural inequality exists. I mean, you said power uses memory to justify its power. If we can help people understand the exact ideas, the exact historical processes that created something like redlining, that creates modern redlining that Wells Fargo and Bank of America and other organizations continue to engage in to continue to promote and to widen a racial wealth gap, then we can be able to create change. When students get up and walk out of their classrooms and out of their schools because they're pissed off that they're not able to learn a history that they want to know, that's how we affect change. And we affect it from the top down as well. And with the power of our vote, with the power that we have to instill in particular politicians that we will not tolerate these things, that's how we create change. When you allow people to remain ignorant, then you can control them. And that's why African American studies have been removed from these spaces. That's why people are trying to control the flow of information and deny systemic racism, deny racial violence in our history.
Yeah, I think I would say you have to do both.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not willing to cede the public sphere of education. We know that 9 out of 10 American children attends public schools. There's nothing else in American life that exists where people across every sector of American society engage in the same institution, except for our public schools. And so I think that you would never want to simply cede that ground, that if we are to have any chance of having a common understanding of our history, a common understanding of the truth of what actually built both this nation's great wealth and its great inequality and the society we live in today, that we do have to be fighting to have some sort of common curriculum around these issues. Now, that's not going to be easy, particularly because we have dysfunctional, divided government. And of course, most of the agenda for states is, or excuse me, education is set by the states, not the federal government. But there are ways to incentivize. I mean, when you look back to the days of desegregation, the way the federal government began, so the federal government used both carrots and sticks. It would sue you if you weren't integrating or desegregating, but it also increased federal funding exponentially and said you have to desegregate if you want access to these federal funds. And so many districts that were poor and segregated wanted that money. So I think that there are ways that we can incentivize districts. Now, we're in a similarly polarized moment in America where we know red state governors, they walk away from federal funds all the time now, right? They don't care if they're hurting their own citizens. They wouldn't expand Medicaid. They walked away from free lunch federal dollars for young folks, which is just the sign to me of a debased society that will take money to feed its children. So I know that work is hard, but I think we cannot just merely rely on outside entities to try to help our children get this history. And the reason is just too many children will be left out, right? That would just depend on then who would have access to getting this information outside. So I think it has to be both and the last thing I'll say is as I give talks across the country, I really try to help folks understand. So I was an education reporter for most of my career. Before the 1619 Project, I mostly wrote about school segregation, school inequality. I was a schools beat reporter. I sat in on school board meetings. And I know 10 people who come to a school board meeting and make a noise can get policy changed.
Absolutely.
You don't have to have 200 people who are showing up. 10 people can get policy change. And in fact, that's how the folks who are banning our history are getting policy changed. It's not that they have the majority, that they are exercising the will of the people. They're not. They're just showing up and we aren't. And that's the difference. And if we show up in the same way, and we actually have kids in the school, and we actually have a legitimate argument, we can overturn that policy. And I just don't think we're fighting it hard enough.
I tell people that all the time, that you have to be louder than the voices of dissent, because the people who are happy with the curriculum, the people who are happy with the classes that are often offered in their school districts, they don't say anything about it. They're just complacent and they don't think that it can be taken away. But the ones who oppose it, they show up, and a few of them scare the school board members and they shift the change. We have to be louder than they are. That's absolutely right.
Because all the polls show they don't represent the majority. Even in a state like South Carolina, they don't represent the majority. But it doesn't matter because, again, if the majority is just, and I think many of us didn't take this seriously at first. Like it sounded too crazy to take seriously, right? Like you can't literally ban African American studies. It's an opt-in class that students don't even have to take unless they want to. So why would you ban something that students are opting into? It sounds crazy, except we are in a time where what would have seemed impossible even 5 years ago is being legislated all across the country. So, you know, that's the reason they said to stay woke. I know they tried to turn woke into a dirty word, but in our communities, there's a reason why they said that is we need to be paying attention because they're fighting dirty. Most of the people who are getting these laws passed, they don't even have kids in the public schools. Their kids aren't even in the classrooms. They're telling you what your kid can be exposed to in public schools where they don't even send their children. So we need to wake up and we need to fight back.
Yeah, I wanted to just a shout out to the K through 12 educators who are in the audience. We have quite a big number of them here watching, and that's the quiet, loud future. Right now, they are getting ready to go, but they're going to cause a ruckus. The ones that are tied to Common Power are going to cause a ruckus locally, but in the far off future, they're going to dictate policy. I think locally, teachers are not.
We have to have their back.
Right.
That's right.
The problem.
That's right.
I think there are so many courageous educators out there who are teaching the truth regardless of what is being said in the state legislature, who are pushing back. But if we don't have their backs, right, then we are sending a very dangerous message to them that they'll go out on a limb to protect our children's right to learn, and then they can get fired or punished because we are not collectively behind them. So we have to be allies for our teachers and give them the strength and the support. And actually, they shouldn't even have to be the ones waging these battles. These are battles against their own employers. We are the people whose children are in the schools and who fund the public schools, and we should be the ones out there joining with them and really giving them cover and shield.
Right, that's part of having their backs.
Shout out real quick to Jay-Z, who I heard is getting involved in education, maybe in not the best ways. Brother, if you want to help out, man, guarantee the income of some of these teachers that are getting political.
Yeah, because we don't want to shout out what Jay-Z's doing.
I know. He wants to do it the right way. He wants to do it the right way.
Right.
That's right. And we've had educators come and speak to us and work with us who have been fired for teaching classes on social justice. Many who have been teaching them for years, but in this particular political climate, now they're being demonized and attacked.
That's right.
Yeah. And I want to stick on structure, and actually we're bringing one of those educators on in just a moment to ask you a question from Ohio, but I want to stick on structural inequality and some of the things that you're saying about education, because we have truth under assault, whether it is removing African-American studies or removing a book that is written by Linda Lowry about her journey from Selma to Montgomery and saying that that's too divisive and dangerous and saying you can't read that in a school. We also have something that you have written about and investigated and have personal experience with, which is the resegregation of schools. I think for a lot of people, they may not be as familiar with what that means and what occurs in those spaces. Recently, you posted that just a couple of days ago was the 8th anniversary of your cover story for the New York Times Magazine about resegregation in schools in, ironically, the wildly diverse New York City. And you've written about it in Alabama. Charles is sitting in Alabama right now. We do a lot of work in Alabama. And you said, and I love this quote, so I want to read it. Elite parents and politicians conspire with structural inequality to keep our schools separate and unequal. So number one, you have politicians in there, which means we vote them in and we decide if they're not there. So there's power in what we can do there. Number two, can you talk to us about what that looks like? Because I think there are people on this call who don't realize that this is happening. What do those efforts look like? How do they impact economically marginalized Black and Brown children?
Yes, so man, that's a long, complicated answer. I'm going to try to truncate as much as possible, but so one, we should be clear that most of the country outside of the South never actually integrated its schools. The reason I wanted to do that cover story based in New York City was I had been spending a lot of time investigating resegregation in the South, but the reason the South could resegregate is because it actually had desegregated. The North has never really had resegregation because the North never really desegregated. So we love to look down on the South as being backwards and racist, but the South was just explicit with its racism. And the North, as we know, like to hide behind the shield of saying, well, we didn't have Jim Crow laws, and yet used official policy, used gerrymandering, used school attendance zone, housing segregation to keep its schools segregated. And all of the most segregated schools districts in the country are in the North. We can just go down the list. New York, Detroit, Chicago, Philly, just go down the list. And so much of my writing about school inequality and segregation was not speaking to conservatives. It was speaking to progressives. It was speaking to people who say they believe in integration as a ethos, but make entirely different decisions when they're talking about their own children or their own communities. And in fact, often maintain segregation when it comes to practice, even though they say that they believe in integration. So that's what I, was talking about. New York is diverse and yet extremely segregated. Our public school system is only 14% white. Most white American or white people in the city of New York withdraw from the public system altogether. And those who remain in the public system are in majority white schools. So do the math on that. If you are a majority non-white district, how can you have all these majority white schools? That is also a sign, right, of official policy that meshes with individual choice and white parents, and now to a large degree, middle class and upper class Black parents who are using their power to ensure that they don't have to send their children to schools with poor Black and brown children. So much of my work is really trying to get those well-meaning folks to understand the role that they play in maintaining grave inequality for most Black and brown students in this country. And we don't have to look to the South. To this day, the South is the most racially integrated schools in the country. And that's because they were forced to integrate by the courts. The North, even though courts found de jure segregation, which means official segregation in schools all across the country, because we have so much in the South, most school districts were countywide. So you couldn't just leave New York and go to Westchester County if you wanted to avoid integration if you were in the South, right? Because the entire county would be under a desegregation order. But in the North, you might have 20 different school districts in one county. And so the way that we were able to maintain segregation in the North has largely been through housing, and that maintains.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm trying to do is get people the one aspect, really the two aspects of civil rights that we have been the least successful on has been housing and schools. And that's because those are the two aspects where civil rights is personal, right? It's easy to believe in civil rights in the abstract. Well, sure, anybody should be able to vote. Or if you should be able to eat in whatever restaurant you want to go to. But if I don't want to be around Black folks, I just live in a white neighborhood and I go to the restaurants in my white neighborhood, and then I don't have to worry about eating around Black folks. So the intimacy of the classroom has meant that has been the most challenging for us to actually realize the goals and objective of the civil rights movement. And there's a lot of denial. I mean, a lot of denial on behalf of white parents, and now again, increasingly Black parents of some means about the role that they play in this inequality. I don't even know if I answered your question, but that's what I'm gonna do.
You absolutely did. And you made a particular choice with your own daughter, and by your own account, she's thriving.
Yes, I mean, so like I said, I covered education most of my career. I'd written about segregated Black schools, and before I had my own children, was always struck by how all the people who said they were working on behalf of poor Black children in segregated schools, when you'd ask them where did they send their children to school, not one of them, not a single one of them, sent their kids to the schools with the children they said they were fighting for. And that always just seemed the epitome of hypocrisy to me. How can you say those children are worth the same education as any other child, but then say my child is too good to be with those kids? So when we moved to New York City, my daughter was 1. If you know anything about education in New York City, by the time you're 1, parents are already giving you advice on where to send your kid to school. We live in a low-income Black neighborhood. And so as soon as we got there, Folks were telling us we need to start figuring out what private school or, get our child tested for talented and gifted so that we could get her away from the kids in our neighborhood. And my husband and I, it was just opposed to our morals. If we live in a community, we think we should send our child to school in that community. If you believe that all children are worthy of the same education, you can't say all children except for mine. It doesn't mean that there's no sacrifices that come from that. But I think the fact that I think part of why we see what we're seeing in society is we have lost the belief that we have to do things for a common good, that it's okay to sacrifice for a common good sometimes. And really, when you're a person of means, the sacrifice is not that great, right? I could hire a personal tutor. I could do whatever I needed to make up for what my child might not have been getting. I could do that, but I could also bring to that school so much resources that other parents could not. And I really wish that we are where we are in the society because we have really lost this belief that we owe anything to each other. And we have allowed the language of market and capitalism and individual pursuits to really corrupt even our most democratic institutions, which is what public schools are. So that's the choice we made. My daughter's, as we discussed earlier, graduating from 8th grade. She's an honor roll student. She's done great. And the greatest thing is she doesn't think she's better than any other kid in her neighborhood because she's been with them her whole life.
It's good parenting.
That's awesome. On that point too, a reminder to everybody here, and there's a lot of folks from Seattle on this call, one of the biggest, most consequential Supreme Court cases around education and affirmative action. It was based around some parents in Ballard, actually, north part of Seattle, that brought that case all the way to the Supreme Court. So our hands are not clean either. We're going to kick this to one of those educators that we talked about. Ivory Kennedy is on the call. And first, I want to reiterate, Ivory, Nikole's idea about backing you up. Not only do we have your back, but Dr. Terry Scott is going to work on getting somebody with some dollars to back y'all up who are getting busy in these school board meetings. So that's something we're going to work on. And when Dr. Terry puts her mind to it, she's serious about it. But you've got a question here, sir. You've been with us for, well, introduce yourself. Talk about how long you've been with Common Power here and what you're doing right now for The Ohio State University.
Yes, so thank you so much. Thank you, Nikole, for everything that you've shared thus far. I am the program manager, interim as well, for middle childhood education and social studies here. So students that want to be middle school teachers 4 through 9, and then social studies teachers 7 through 12. So going back to what you said, even thinking about your daughter, as a former 8th grade teacher myself who taught American history, and I used the 1619 project in my classroom, and actually one of my former 8th graders is actually here on the call, so it's kind of full circle. Thinking about the narrative that is surrounding the word patriotism, how could you and how would you encourage social studies teachers or history teachers to do a better job of highlighting African-American heroes like Harriet Tubman, Fannie Lou Hamer, and then even those veterans like your father, because you spoke about the flying of the tattered flag in the front yard, as true patriots, especially given that they were fighting for similar rights that the framers of the Constitution were fighting for?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. Love that book on your shelf back there.
Signed it.
Excellent. And just thank you for being an educator. We know most of our kids can go all the way through 12th grade without ever having a Black male educator. So I know how important that is. And if you read the preface to that book, you know it was a Black male educator that introduced me to the year 1619, Mr. Ray Dial. So really can have a transformative impact on students of all races. I love the framing of that question because really that is what I'm trying to do with the democracy essay, and really the entire project is to get us to reframe kind of our understanding of who has been the great democratizing force in the United States. So when we talk about the Civil War, or we talk about the civil rights movement. When we talk about the Civil War, we talk about the Civil War, for instance, as, white people going to war to liberate Black folks. And we completely erase Black people as if Black people were not fighting to free themselves. And in fact, we know from historical research that some 80%, I think about 77, of eligible Black men in the North fought in the Union Army. Think about that. No other group had a rate of participation in the Union Army at that rate. And of course, it makes sense. This might not have been a war for liberation for the white folks who were fighting it, but certainly for Black people, this was a war for liberation. 200,000 soldiers, Black soldiers fought in the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln himself credited the Black soldiers with saving the Union, because the only reason that Black men were allowed to finally fight in the war was because the Union was losing. And white people, once they began to think that this was a war over slavery, they didn't want to fight anymore, right? So we saw the draft riots, and they weren't signing up and they were deserting. So he had to allow Black people who had been begging to fight. This is how racist our country is, right? Like, you're fighting a war and will not let people who can help you win that war fight, because you don't think Black people should fight, because if you arm them, they'll expect to be treated as men and citizens. So we saved the Union, and yet we get erased from that story, except that one little movie, Glory, right? It's the only inkling that Black folks were even fighting in that war. And then you think about the way we talk about something like the Civil Rights Movement. We talk about this as if this were a Black rights movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a movement to democratize the United States.
Amen.
Period. Right? So when we think of patriotism and who gets to be called a patriot and who gets to be considered the architects of the freedoms that we all enjoy, not just that we as Black people enjoy, but all people enjoy, the face of those people are never Black. And that is the argument of the project, is that those white men in 1776 through 1790s, they wrote out the lofty ideals of freedom, but they did not believe in those ideals in practice. But Black folks read those words and said, actually, we believe that those words should be made manifest for all people, and have fought generation after generation to make those true. How empowering is that for a Black child to get that version of understanding of the contributions that Black people have made to the American project? But how empowering is that for any member of a marginalized group to see people who are a small racial minority who had literally been brought here as property, really architecting and bringing about the reality of democracy in the United States? I think that reframing is so critical. Though I myself am, I have very complex feelings about patriotism in general. And I don't know that the role of social studies or history teachers should be to teach patriotism. I think the role of maybe civics teachers should teach patriotism. I don't know. But I think when we start teaching patriotism, we necessarily then teach children that their nation is better than other nations, and therefore they're deserving of things that are other countries might not be deserving of. We can see the realities of that every day, and whose lives we think are important and whose lives we think are not important. So I have a very, I still have a very complicated view of what patriotism is, but I certainly would say if we were to subscribe to any notion of patriotism, it's not the performative flag pin wearing, my country can do no wrong patriotism. It is the type of patriotism that Black folks have always had, which is to critique and to fight your own countrymen and women if necessary, to force the country to live up to its ideals. And the ideals are majestic. We just have never actually lived up to them yet.
It makes me think of Langston Hughes, for America to be what it will be. That is a form of patriotism, to make America what it should be. Yes, that's beautiful. We have the chat. I cannot believe that we're almost coming to a close of the time. It just feels like it whipped by. I wish you could be here for hours and hours. Hopefully you'll come back sometime soon. But so much has been coming through the chat. We have a couple more questions for you. Somebody wrote that they thanked you for reconstructing the soul of America. And I think that's a very appropriate comment for them to make. And you have done so much even before the 1619 Project. And then, of course, the 1619 Project just broadened the audience tremendously. And the work is revolutionary. And now it has become a documentary and so many things that we talked about in the beginning. And it hasn't been without a cost to you personally. You know, we are engaged in this work in Common Power that is the work that we want to do, because it's the work that changes people. It's the work that creates change and creates democracy for all. And it is work where sometimes people attack you, and it is emotionally heavy. You have been attacked so much and on a public platform. How do you deal with it? How do you keep going? What can you say to our audience about perseverance? Because you are killing it.
Thank you. I definitely would have answered that question very differently 3 to 4 years ago, where I think I really did become overwhelmed by the attacks. I really did let them take both a mental and physical toll on me. But what I have realized is folks don't attack you with that level of vengeance an organization if you're not having impact. And if the work wasn't having impact, nobody would bother with it. And you certainly wouldn't see the type of power that aligned against the project, aligning against it. You wouldn't see, President Trump castigating the work. You wouldn't see state senators introducing legislation against it. You wouldn't see states trying to ban it, school boards. You wouldn't see all of that if the work didn't matter. So understanding that, and then being a student of history and knowing, my spiritual godmother is Ida B. Wells. This was a woman who had the courage to do her work at a time when Black people had no protection. She didn't do her work for the New York Times. She didn't do her work in a place where Black people had rights. So if she could do it, my life is easy. And I know, who I do this work for every one person who has tried to attack, I've heard from thousands of others who support the work and believe in the work and have felt the work to be transformative. So for me, it's easy. I know who I do the work for. I say all the time, and I'm not joking when I say it, I'm built for this. My grandmother, Arlena Tillman, was born on a cotton plantation into a family of sharecroppers. My father was born on that same plantation. My life is easy. They could not even imagined that their progeny would one day live the life that I live. So every day I just am trying to repay my debt.
That's beautiful. It make me cry.
So along those same lines, and I gotta say too, shout out to my father, who's a Black Panther, and did it the hard way. So I think the same way, actually. When I wake up and I do this work, I think we actually got it pretty easy compared to the folks who fought and bled and died, actually, just to register to vote.
That's right.
Let alone vote. For those folks, along the lines of how do you keep going? And again, I keep calling back to the president and the people who are here. This is a community of people who are working for other people, who are coming together to get out the vote in 2024. And we're about halfway through, but we're not even to the tough part. What would you say to them? Because they're listening right now. What would you say to them as a message to call back on, to keep going when it gets tough? Because it's going to get much harder for all of us.
It is. I'm not a inspirational speaker. I'm the person who has to bring the dose of reality. We are in some very dark times, I'm afraid. You look at what's happening with the Supreme Court. I think even no matter what happens with this election, the problems that we're facing, the erosion of democracy, the threats against democracy, the threats against civil rights, the deterioration of women's rights, all of this is going to continue. But what I will say is we have always had people who believe that the impossible could be made possible. That when in my darkest moments, I think about, someone like Frederick Douglass in 1835. Could he have imagined that in 30 years slavery would end? Had to believe it was possible, but there was no reason. Slavery was increasing. There was no reason for him to believe that in 30 years, that institution that had lasted since 1619, would come to an end, but it did.
Mm.
Think about someone like a Fannie Lou Hamer or Diane Nash or John Lewis. No reason to believe that they could end the system of racial apartheid within a decade, and yet they did. So even when we know that our adversaries seem like they're winning, that we know there are dark times ahead, we also know that we have the ultimate power to change our society and to make what seems impossible possible. But we have to do that work. So we can't give up. We can have our moments where we have to, you know, close out the world and weep or drink or do whatever you need to do. And then you get yourself together and get your ass up the next day and you go out and fight again. Because we had amazing ancestors, all of us. And our obligation is to become great ancestors ourselves one day. But we don't have a choice but to fight. You don't have to fight every single day. Don't kill yourselves doing it, because that doesn't do any of us any good. But understand the difference between us and them is we're on the side of right.
That's right.
And that's one thing that I know every single day. I'm fighting for all people. I believe that we have enough in this country where we can take care. We don't have to have homelessness. We don't have to have all of this incarceration. We don't have to have students who are struggling in schools that don't educate them. We can feed every American. We can house every American. We can give healthcare to every American. We can do those things. Yeah. That's what our side is fighting for. We know that that is right and just. So when you know that what you're fighting for is the right thing, what more motivation than you need? Even if you may not see it yourself, right? I mean, think about Dr. King, like the last sermon he gave before he was assassinated. He knew he wasn't going to make it, and he told his people, I may not get there with you, but I'm going to fight every day, because if I don't get there, my grandchild will. And she has. So that's what I give us.
Wow.
Nikole, you are inspirational. Come on.
I
now.
know. What are you saying? You're
Come
not an
on.
inspirational speaker, you know? And Miss Nikole Hannah-Jones, I know that your grandmother is so proud of you. Make the impossible possible, you said, and get your ass up and do the work. Amen to all of that. We cannot thank you enough. We cannot tell you how honored we are to have had you with us this evening. Thank you so much. We do hope that you will join us again. I'm sure our paths will cross soon somewhere in Alabama. Charles, is there any last things you wanted to say?
Hey, I'm ready to get to work, y'all. Let's go.
Let's do it.
Let's go. Thanks, Nikole. We'll see you again. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good night.
Evening.
Bye-bye.
The chat has an